heart's ambition. One just wanted a moment to breathe. She found a heavy velvet curtain. He found her. Somerset mud had a peculiar way of clinging to everything it touched. It caked the wheels of the rented carriage, splattered against the mahogany doors, and seemed to seep through the floorboards, dragging the temperature inside down to a damp, bone-aching chill. Inside the carriage, the air was entirely different. It was stifling, hot, anxious, and thick with the smell of cheap lavender water and nervous sweat. Lady Edith Montgomery sat rigid on the velvet cushions, her knuckles white as she gripped the ivory handle of her fan. She was a woman built of sheer, unyielding willpower, currently holding the frayed edges of her family's respectability together through sheer force of habit. Her husband had died 3 years prior, leaving behind nothing but a sprawling estate in Yorkshire that was mortgaged to the hilt, and a ledger of gambling debts that kept Edith awake until dawn. "Pinch your cheeks, Rosalind," Edith snapped. Her eyes darted to her eldest daughter. "You look like a corpse. Dukes do not marry corpses. They marry robust women who can give them robust heirs." Rosalind, 21 and terrifyingly beautiful, obeyed without a word. She dug her manicured nails into her pale cheeks until they bloomed with a harsh, artificial pink. She was the weapon, the family's golden ticket. Rosalind understood her assignment perfectly. She was to smile, play the pianoforte with acceptable mediocrity, and secure a proposal from Nathaniel Reed, the Duke of Aldridge. Beside her sat Celia, 19, reciting French verbs under her breath in a frantic, buzzing whisper. Celia was the contingency plan. If Rosalind failed to catch the Duke's eye, Celia was to trip gracefully into his path, laugh at his jokes, and hope he preferred blondes with nervous dispositions. And then there was Nora. Nora sat facing backward, her shoulder pressed against the cold glass of the carriage window. At 20, she was neither the breathtaking beauty nor the charming backup. She was the third sister, the afterthought. Her dark hair was pinned up in a style that was already unraveling, and her dress, a hand-me-down from Rosalind, hastily altered by a half-blind seamstress, pinched terribly at the armpits. "Stop slouching, Nora," Edith barked without even looking at her. Motherly intuition, honed by desperation. "You are bending the boning in your stays. Do you know what those stays cost?" "More than my comfort, evidently," Nora muttered, shifting her weight. The whalebone dug a fresh, agonizing groove into her ribs. Edith ignored the comment. She leaned forward as the massive iron gates of Aldridge Hall loomed through the dreary afternoon mist. "Listen to me, all of you. This house party is our final hour. Lord Croft's solicitors have threatened to seize the Yorkshire house by Christmas. We have precisely 2 weeks to convince the Duke that a Montgomery girl is the answer to his bachelorhood. Rosalind, you will agree with everything he says. Celia, you will laugh only when it is appropriate. Nora." Edith paused, her gaze sweeping over her youngest daughter with a mixture of exhaustion and faint irritation. "Nora, just try not to frighten anyone. Read a book in the corner. Stay out of Rosalind's light." "Gladly," Nora said. She meant it. The very idea of parading herself before a strange man, performing like a dancing bear in a town square to beg for her financial survival, made her stomach churn. It was humiliating. It was a cattle auction. Only the cattle wore silk and pretended they were having a marvelous time. The carriage jerked to a halt, the wheels protesting as they ground into the crushed gravel of the Duke's sweeping driveway. Outside, the estate of Aldridge Hall rose from the earth like a stone fortress. It was massive, imposing, and reeked of generational wealth. A small army of footmen descended the limestone steps, opening doors and offering gloved hands to the arriving guests. Nora stepped out, her thin leather slippers instantly sinking into the damp gravel. She shivered. Around them, half a dozen other carriages were unloading their cargo. Dozens of girls, all wrapped in expensive furs and bright silks, all sporting the same desperate, predatory glint in their eyes. The competition. Rosalind smoothed her skirts, her chin lifting as she adjusted her invisible armor. Celia took a deep, shuddering breath. Nora just looked at the massive oak doors of the manor and calculated how long she could reasonably hide in the library before someone sent a search party. She suspected no one would bother looking for her at all. The thought brought her a small, cynical measure of comfort as she followed her mother into the lion's den. The grand drawing room of Aldridge Hall was a masterpiece of intimidation. Gold leaf crawled up the cornices. Massive crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across the patterned carpets, and the walls were lined with portraits of dead men who looked thoroughly disappointed in the living. Currently, the room held roughly 60 people. 30 of them were young, eligible women. 30 of them were their eagle-eyed mothers, and in the center of the room stood the prize. Nathaniel Reed, the Duke of Aldridge, didn't look like a man enjoying his wealth. He looked like a man enduring a prolonged root canal. He was 30 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, but he lacked the polished, delicate refinement favored by London society. His jaw was square and permanently shadowed with stubble. His nose had a faint crook in it, suggesting someone had punched him a long time ago. Nora silently commended whoever had done it. He wore a dark coat that fit perfectly, but he wore it as though it were a uniform he couldn't wait to take off. He stood near the massive marble fireplace, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand, nodding mechanically as a viscount's daughter chattered at him. "Look at him," Lady Edith breathed, her fingers biting into Rosalind's arm. "He is magnificent. 10,000 acres in Somerset alone. Rosalind, go. Drop your fan. Do something." Rosalind didn't need to be told twice. She detached herself from her mother and drifted across the room with the practiced grace of a hunting falcon. Nora watched, a morbid fascination taking hold as her sister expertly navigated the crowd, timing her approach perfectly, so she arrived at the Duke's side just as the Viscount's daughter paused for breath. Nora couldn't hear what Rosalind said, but she saw the result. Rosalind smiled. That perfect, calculated curve of her lips. She curtsied, exposing just the right amount of a pale, elegant neck. The Duke looked down at her. His expression did not change. He offered a polite, abbreviated bow. He said something brief. Rosalind laughed musically. It was utterly soulless. Nora felt a sudden, crushing weight on her chest. The air in the room was thick, saturated with the competing scents of rosewater, bergamot, and burning wax. The fire roared too hot. The chatter of 60 women was a high-pitched, echoing cacophony that drilled directly into her temples. Her corset, already too tight, felt as though it were shrinking by the second. She took a shallow breath, but her lungs met the immovable barrier of whalebone and canvas. A thin sheen of cold sweat broke out on her neck. "I am going to faint," she realized with a spike of horror. "I am going to pass out in the middle of a duke's drawing room, and Mother will actually murder me." She began to back away, step by step. She kept her eyes lowered, avoiding the gaze of the dowagers who sat on the velvet sofas, judging the livestock. The edge of the room was lined with massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out into the pitch-black night. Each window was framed by heavy, burgundy velvet curtains, tied back with thick gold tassels. Nora reached the wall. She felt a sliver of a draught seeping through the glass, cold, glorious night air. Without thinking, without caring about propriety, or her mother's strict instructions to remain visible but unremarkable, Nora stepped sideways. She slipped behind the thick fold of the burgundy curtain, letting the heavy velvet fall shut behind her. Instantly, the noise of the room was muffled. The heat receded. She was encased in a small, dark sanctuary between the glass and the fabric. Nora leaned her forehead against the freezing window pane. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands went to her waist, pressing against her ribs, trying to find an inch of slack in the dress. There was none. She looked down at her feet. Her left shoe was rubbing her heel raw. "To hell with it," she whispered. She reached down, unlaced the ribbon, and kicked the shoe off. Her toes flexed against the cold wooden floorboards. The relief was instantaneous, a sharp contrast to the dull ache in her back. She leaned against the window frame, fully prepared to stand on one foot in the dark for the next 3 hours. Then the curtain rustled. A hand gripped the edge of the velvet and pulled it back. Light from the drawing room sliced into the dark alcove. Nora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She expected to see her mother's furious face, or perhaps a footman come to shoo her out of the drapery. Instead, a man stepped into the narrow space. He let the curtain drop behind him, plunging them back into shadows. He didn't see her at first. He leaned back against the wall, tilted his head toward the ceiling, and let out a long, rough exhale that sounded remarkably like a curse. Nora stood perfectly still, balanced awkwardly on one bare foot. It was him, the Duke of Aldridge. Up close, the shadows under his eyes were darker, bruised with exhaustion. He brought his glass to his lips, swallowed the remaining liquor in a single, hard gulp, and lowered the glass. He turned his head and finally noticed he was not alone. He didn't flinch, he didn't gasp. He just stared at her in the dim light filtering through the fabric. He looked from her face, down to her ill-fitting dress, and finally to the single bare foot resting on top of her other shoe. "Well," Nathaniel Reed said, his voice a low, dry gravel. "This alcove is remarkably crowded for a place designed to fit precisely no one." For a terrifying second, Nora considered apologizing, curtsying, and throwing herself back into the suffocating heat of the drawing room. It was what Rosalind would do. It was what any sane, desperate woman with a mortgage hanging over her head would do, but her corset was biting into her ribs, her heel was bleeding, and she was simply too tired to play the game. "It was vacant when I claimed it," Nora said, keeping her voice flat. She didn't move. She didn't lower her eyes. The Duke raised an eyebrow. The faint light caught the harsh angle of his jaw. "Claimed it? Are we planting flags now? I must inform my steward that a portion of the East Wing has been annexed by—" He trailed off, waiting. "Nobody," Nora provided. "I am nobody of consequence, just a casualty of the evening." He let out a short, sudden sound, a laugh completely devoid of humor. "A casualty? I like that. Who wounded you? The Dowager Countess of Grantham? Her breath is known to strip paint from the walls." "My corset, actually," Nora said. The words slipped out before she could catch them. The sheer, inappropriate honesty of it hung in the small space between them. A lady did not mention her undergarments to a man. She certainly didn't mention them to a duke. She braced herself for his disgust. Instead, Nathaniel leaned heavily against the window frame opposite her. He looked out into the pitch-black night, resting the side of his head against the glass, just as she had done moments before. "If it is any consolation," he murmured, his voice drained of the polite aristocracy he had been wielding out there. "My cravat is currently attempting to strangle me. I give it 10 minutes before it succeeds." Nora studied him. He wasn't looking at her like she was a prize mare. He wasn't assessing her hips or her teeth. He was just a man hiding behind a curtain, treating her like a fellow inmate in a very expensive asylum. "Why are you hiding?" Nora asked. "It's your house. You could simply ask them all to leave." "I could," he agreed quietly. He turned the empty glass in his hands, watching the dim light catch the crystal. "But I invited them. Or rather, my solicitor invited them." He informed me that I am 30. I am unmarried, and if I break my neck jumping a horse next week without an heir, the estate goes to a cousin in Bath who breeds ornamental pugs. Nora couldn't stop the small snort of laughter that escaped her. She quickly clamped a hand over her mouth. Nathaniel's eyes flicked to her. A genuine spark of amusement broke through the exhausted haze in his expression. It is not a laughing matter. The pugs are vicious. I couldn't subject my tenants to that kind of tyranny. So you decided to subject yourself to a cattle auction instead, Nora said softly. He held her gaze. The silence in the alcove stretched, thick and heavy, but entirely devoid of the anxiety that plagued the room beyond the curtain. The muffled sounds of the piano and polite laughter felt miles away. A cattle auction, Nathaniel repeated. He tilted his head. Is that how it feels on your side of the curtain? How else should it feel? Nora looked away, staring at her bare foot. The cynical armor she usually wore felt thin in the dark. We are scrubbed, polished, dressed in silks we cannot afford, and paraded into your home so you might point a finger at the one with the shiniest hair and the widest hips. It is humiliating. For everyone involved. She expected him to defend the system. He was the one holding all the cards, after all. He held the title, the money, the power to save her family or doom them. It is, Nathaniel said simply. Nora looked back up at him in surprise. I have stood by that fireplace for 2 hours, he continued, his voice barely more than a rough whisper. I have had 15 women tell me I have a beautiful home. 10 have lied and said they enjoy hunting. 5 have conveniently tripped in front of me, requiring me to catch them. Nora winced. Celia, they look at me, Nathaniel said, and they don't see a man. They see a ledger. They see a title, a carriage, a vault of gold. They smile with their mouths, but their eyes are doing arithmetic. He looked directly at Nora, his gaze piercing through the gloom. But you aren't doing arithmetic, are you? I am terrible at mathematics, Nora admitted flatly. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. It changed his entire face, softening the harsh lines, making him suddenly, dangerously human. I should return, Nathaniel sighed, though he made absolutely no move toward the curtain. If the Duke is absent for too long, the mothers will begin hunting in packs. They will corner me in the billiard room. Take a pool cue, Nora advised. Defend yourself. I am unarmed, he deadpanned. I left my cue in the armory. Nora smiled. A real smile. It felt strange on her face after a week of miserable scowling. Then you are doomed, Your Grace. He stared at her smile for a long moment. His eyes dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. The air in the alcove shifted, the casual banter suddenly giving way to a quiet, undeniable tension. He was close enough that she could smell him over the scent of the dusty velvet, leather, bergamot, and the sharp tang of whiskey. Perhaps, he murmured. Put your shoe back on, miss. He left the sentence hanging, waiting for her name. Nora hesitated. She thought of Rosalind out there, working tirelessly to secure this man's fortune. She thought of her mother's desperate, gripping fingers. If she gave him her name, she entered to the game. She became a competitor. She didn't want to be a competitor. She just wanted to be a girl hiding behind a curtain. Good night, Your Grace, Nora said quietly. She didn't give him her name. She leaned down, grabbed her shoe, and slipped it roughly onto her aching foot. She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing against his solid chest, and slipped through the slit in the curtain. The heat, the noise, and the glaring light of the drawing room hit her like a physical blow. She blinked against the brightness, keeping her head down, and melted into the crowd before he could follow her out. From the corner of the room, Lady Edith's sharp eyes locked onto her. Her mother began marching through the crowd, looking furious. Nora didn't care. Her heel was bleeding, her corset was still a torture device. and her family was still broke. But as she glanced back at the heavy burgundy drape, she saw a large masculine hand brush against the fabric, parting it just a fraction. Through the narrow slit, Nathaniel Reed was watching her, and he was no longer looking at him with boredom. He was looking at it like a hunter who had just caught a scent. The guest chamber, assigned to the Montgomery women, was in the north wing. It was a beautiful room, decorated in pale blues and silver, but the fireplace smoked, and the draught from the sash windows was practically a gale. Lady Edith's fingers dug into Nora's forearm the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. "Where did you go?" Edith's voice was a harsh, terrified hiss. She did not yell. Yelling could be heard through walls, and the Montgomerys could not afford to be loud. "I spent an hour looking for you. Lady Shelby asked if you had taken ill." "Do you know how damaging an impression of frailty is?" "I was behind a curtain," Nora said flatly. She pulled her arm free, her skin throbbing where her mother's nails had bitten in. A curtain. Edith stared at her, the lines around her mouth hardening into deep, bitter grooves. "While your sister is out there fighting for our very survival, you are playing hide-and-seek with the drapery. I was suffocating, Mother. My heel was bleeding. I removed myself so I would not faint on the Duke's Persian rug." Edith dismissed this with a sharp wave of her hand. Physical pain was irrelevant. Survival was everything. She turned her frantic energy to Rosalind, who was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, looking like a shattered porcelain doll. "Unlace her, Celia," Edith commanded. Celia scrambled to obey, her trembling fingers working at the tight silk cords at Rosalind's back. When the heavy gown finally fell away and the brutal canvas corset was loosened, Rosalind let out a ragged, whistling breath. She slumped forward, bracing her hands on her knees. The linen shift beneath was soaked in sweat. Angry, deep red welts dug into her ribs and waist, where the whalebone had mercilessly compressed her internal organs for 6 hours. Nora felt a surge of fierce, protective pity. She hated the game, but she didn't hate her sister. Rosalind was simply the best soldier they had, sent to the front lines in silk armor. "Did he smile, Rosalind?" Edith asked, pacing the length of the cold floor. "When you spoke of the hounds, did he smile?" "He nodded," Rosalind whispered, her voice hoarse. "He said his head gamekeeper handles the breeding." "Did he look at your mouth?" Rosalind closed her eyes. "I do not know, Mother. He looked tired. He looked through me, like I was a pane of glass. You are not glass. You are a mirror. You reflect back to him exactly what he wishes to see," Edith snapped. She walked over and lifted Rosalind's chin. "Tomorrow is the promenade to the lake. You will wear the peach muslin. You will be vibrant. You will not let him look through you again." Nora turned away, quietly unlacing her own ruined bodice. She didn't ask for help. She wriggled out of the stifling fabric, the cool air of the drafty room hitting her damp skin. Her own ribs mirrored Rosalind's, bruised, red, and tender to the touch. This was what the world didn't see. The men in the drawing rooms only saw the tiny waists and the effortless grace. They didn't see the bruised ribs, the bleeding heels, the desperate calculations made in freezing bedrooms at midnight. She thought of Nathaniel Reed in the dark alcove. They smile with their mouths, but their eyes are doing arithmetic. He knew. He saw the machinery beneath the silk. The next morning, Somerset delivered a heavy, bruised sky. It wasn't raining, but the threat of it hung in the air, pressing down on the manicured lawns of Aldridge Hall. The breakfast room was an exercise in psychological warfare. 30 young women sat around a monstrous mahogany table, delicately pushing eggs and toast around their plates. To eat heartily was considered vulgar, To have an appetite was unladylike. Nora sat at the far end of the table, entirely out of her mother's line of sight, and quietly demolished a plate of kippers, 3 sausages, and a massive slice of buttered bread. She was starving. The nervous energy of the house burned calories, and Nora had no intention of fading away. She watched Rosalind across the room, taking microscopic bites of a dry biscuit, smiling bravely at a boring anecdote delivered by the Duke's elderly aunt. Nathaniel was not there. The footman poured tea and whispered that His Grace was in his study, dealing with the estate manager. A collective sigh of disappointment rippled down the table. The peacocks had preened for an absent audience. As soon as she finished her tea, Nora stood. The other girls were gathering in the morning room to do needlepoint and ruthlessly compliment each other while secretly looking for flaws. Nora had no interest in the blood sport. She slipped out the side door, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the north wing. She was looking for the library. If she was going to be trapped in a gilded cage for a fortnight, she intended to at least raid the owner's bookshelves. She found it behind a set of heavy, brass-studded doors. The Aldridge Library was not a room for show. It smelled of beeswax, old leather, and a faint, lingering trace of wood smoke. The shelves stretched 2 stories high, accessed by wrought-iron spiral staircases. It was magnificent. It was quiet. Nora walked down the center aisle, dragging her fingers lightly across the spines of the books. History, philosophy, agriculture. She pulled a worn volume of Greek myths from a shelf, blew the dust from the top edge, and turned to find a window seat. "If you are looking for the poetry, it is in the East Wing," a rough voice said. "My grandfather thought poetry was frivolous and banished it." Nora jumped, the heavy book slipping from her grasp. It didn't hit the floor. A large hand caught it mid-air. Nathaniel stood there, having materialized from the shadows between the shelves. He was not wearing the immaculate dark coat of the previous evening. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. A smudge of ink stained his left thumb. He looked less like a duke and more like a man who worked for a living. He looked down at the book in his hand, then back up at her. "You didn't give me your name last night," he said quietly. Nora stood frozen in the narrow aisle between the towering shelves. The dusty light from the high-arched windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air between them. "I didn't think it mattered," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden, erratic thumping in her chest. "It mattered to me." He handed the book back to her. His fingers brushed hers, warm, slightly calloused. A shock of heat traveled up her arm. She quickly pulled the book to her chest like a shield. "Nora Montgomery," she said. There was no point in lying. "I am Rosalind's sister." Recognition flickered in his dark eyes. "Ah, the beauty in the pale blue silk, the one who dropped her fan with the precision of a military tactician." Nora's jaw tightened. "She is fighting for her life, Your Grace. Try not to hold it against her." Nathaniel leaned against the bookshelf, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked exhausted. The ink on his thumb matched the dark circles under his eyes. "I don't hold it against her. I understand the mechanics of the market, but it makes for miserable conversation." He tilted his head, studying her. "You are not fighting for your life?" "I am the 3rd daughter," Nora stated, a blunt, cynical edge creeping into her voice. "My family has precisely enough capital to launch one of us successfully. Rosalind is the capital ship. Celia is the dinghy. I am the ballast. I am here to make the room look full and stay out of the way." "The ballast," Nathaniel's mouth twitched. "That is a terrible way to view yourself." "It is a practical way to view myself. It prevents disappointment." He didn't laugh this time. He just looked at her, his expression stripping away the aristocratic veneer. It was the same look he had given her in the dark behind the curtain. It was heavy, searching, and deeply unsettling. "Come here," he said softly. He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and walked down the aisle toward a massive oak desk situated near the fireplace. It was buried under a snowdrift of papers, maps, and heavy leather-bound ledgers. Nora hesitated, then followed him. He picked up a thick ledger, bound in scuffed green leather, and dropped it heavily onto the center of the desk. He flipped it open. The pages were covered in cramped, aggressive handwriting. Columns of numbers marched down the margins. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "A ledger," Nora replied, glancing at the columns. "It is a list of every tenant farmer on the Aldridge estate whose roof is currently leaking," Nathaniel said, tapping a long finger against the page. 240 families. Below that, the cost of slate. Below that, the cost of timber. Over here, he flipped a page, is the debt my father left when he died on a hunting trip 2 years ago. He was fond of racehorses and terrible at choosing them. Nora looked from the numbers to his face. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because last night you accused me of parading women around so I could point a finger at the widest hips. You think I am enjoying this?" His voice was low, laced with a bitter exhaustion. "I loathe it. I am £20,000 in debt. I have villagers that will freeze this winter if I do not fix their cottages. My solicitor tells me the only way to secure the credit I need from the London banks is to prove stability, to marry, to produce an heir, to stop looking like a reckless bachelor who might break his neck and leave the estate in chaos." He closed the ledger with a sharp crack that echoed in the quiet library. "I don't need a porcelain doll who drops her fan," Nathaniel said, looking directly into her eyes. "I don't need a woman who recites French poetry. I need a partner. I need someone who understands that this house is sinking into the mud, and who is willing to grab a bucket and bail water with me." Nora's breath hitched. The raw honesty of it stripped away every defense she had built. He wasn't a god on a pedestal. He was a drowning man. "Then you invited the wrong women," Nora said softly. "The women out there don't know how to bail water. They only know how to drown gracefully." Nathaniel took a step closer to her. The smell of wood smoke and ink wrapped around her. "Not all of them." Panic, sharp and cold, spiked in Nora's chest. She took a step back, her spine hitting the edge of the desk. "No, no, Your Grace. You do not get to look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I am an option." Her voice trembled, and she hated herself for it. "Rosalind needs you. My mother will be turned out into the street by Christmas if Rosalind does not marry well. I am the ballast, remember. If you look at me, you sink my entire family." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. The muscle feathered near his ear. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to tear down the ridiculous societal rules that caged them both. But he was a man trapped by his own ledgers, and she was a girl trapped by her mother's debts. Before he could speak, the heavy brass doors of the library swung open. "Your Grace!" Lord Shelby's booming voice shattered the quiet. "The ladies are gathering for the promenade to the lake. You promised to lead the party." Nathaniel didn't look away from Nora immediately. He held her gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he stepped back, the mask of the Duke sliding effortlessly back into place over the tired man. "I am coming, Shelby," he called out smoothly. He gave Nora a brief, formal bow. "Miss Montgomery, enjoy the Greeks." He walked out, leaving the ledger on the desk and the scent of wood smoke fading in the air. Nora gripped the edge of the oak wood until her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her bruised ribs. The promenade to the lake was a disaster waiting to happen. The sky had darkened from a bruised purple to a menacing charcoal black. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and incoming rain. Yet 30 women, swathed in impractical muslins, delicate silks, and thin leather slippers, marched stubbornly down the gravel path toward the ornamental lake. Lady Edith walked at the rear with the dowagers, her eyes fixed like sniper sights on the front of the column where Nathaniel walked. Rosalind had managed to secure the position on his right. She looked breathtaking. The peach muslin dress stood out violently against the gloomy landscape, and she was employing every weapon in her arsenal. She laughed. She pointed gracefully at the swans. She asked him questions about the estate's history, her voice a melodious chime in the heavy air. Nathaniel was perfectly polite. He answered her questions. He offered his arm when the gravel grew uneven. But Nora, trailing 20 paces behind with the younger, less aggressive daughters, could see the tension in his shoulders. He was enduring the walk. "He likes her," Celia whispered nervously, linking her arm through Nora's. "Mother says he is definitely leaning toward her." "He is leaning away from the wind, Celia," Nora muttered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. They reached the edge of the lake, where a crumbling stone folly, a romanticized ruin built by Nathaniel's grandfather, stood overlooking the water. The wind picked up, whipping the skirts of the women into frantic, snapping flags. And then the sky broke. It didn't drizzle. It didn't sprinkle. It unleashed a torrential, freezing deluge of Somerset rain. Chaos erupted. Women shrieked, throwing their hands over their elaborate bonnets. The dowagers abandoned their dignity and began sprinting back toward the manor house, their heavy velvet cloaks dragging in the sudden mud. "Rosalind, the folly!" Lady Edith screamed over the wind, pointing frantically to the stone structure. The younger guests bolted for the shelter of the ruined walls. Nora, however, didn't run. She stood frozen for a second, watching the absolute destruction of £1,000 worth of silk and feathers occurring in real time. She turned to follow Celia toward the folly, but her thin slipper caught on a slick, mossy stone hidden in the gravel. She pitched forward, landing hard on her hands and knees in the muck. The wet earth soaked instantly through her skirt, chilling her to the bone. She hissed in pain, examining her scraped palms, completely coated in thick black mud. "Get up." The voice was rough, barking over the sound of the rain. Large hands gripped her under the arms, hauling her upright with effortless strength. Nora blinked the rain out of her eyes. Nathaniel was standing there, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. His immaculate coat was already soaked. "I can walk!" Nora gasped, trying to pull away. She was a disaster. She was covered in mud, her hair was plastered to her cheeks, and she looked like a drowned rat. "Don't be an idiot!" he growled. He didn't guide her toward the folly where the other women, including Rosalind, were huddled, watching them with wide, shocked eyes. He bypassed them entirely. He took Nora by the hand, ignoring the mud covering her fingers, and pulled her toward the thickest part of the tree line, where the massive canopy of an ancient oak tree offered a natural umbrella against the downpour. They stepped under the heavy branches. The rain immediately reduced to a heavy, echoing drip. Nora stood shivering, wrapping her arms around her chest. The cold was biting into her damp skin. Without a word, Nathaniel shrugged off his heavy, tailored coat. He stepped close to her and draped it over her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body, smelling intensely of him. "You shouldn't have done that," Nora said, her teeth chattering. She looked back toward the folly. 30 pairs of eyes were burning holes through the rain, staring directly at them. Lady Edith looked as though she were about to have an aneurysm. "Done what?" Nathaniel asked, swiping the wet hair out of his eyes. He stood in his soaked linen shirt, completely indifferent to the cold. "You bypassed Rosalind. You chose to pull me out of the mud." Nora looked up at him, panic rising in her throat. Do you realize what you've just done? You've humiliated her. You've humiliated my mother. I will pay for this when we return to the house. I am not marrying your sister, Nora. The words cut through the sound of the rain like a gunshot. Nora froze. You don't know that. I know it, Nathaniel said, taking a step closer. The air between them felt suddenly electric, heavy with something far more dangerous than the storm. She is beautiful, and she is desperate, and she would make a perfectly acceptable Duchess. But she would bore me to death within a month, and I would make her miserable. Then choose someone else, Nora whispered, her voice cracking. Choose Lady Shelby. Choose the Viscount's daughter. Do not choose me. Why? Because I told you, I am the ballast. If you pull me up, my family drowns. Tears of pure, hot frustration mixed with the rain on her cheeks. If you do not choose Rosalind, Lord Croft takes the house. We will have nothing. Nathaniel reached out. He didn't care about the mud. He gently caught her face in his large, warm hands, his thumbs brushing over her cold cheekbones. I told you in the library, he said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce murmur. I am drowning too. I need someone to bail the water. He stepped into her space, his chest brushing against the heavy wool of the coat she wore. Let me worry about Lord Croft. Let me worry about your mother's debts. You just have to tell me one thing. Nora couldn't breathe. The corset was tight, but it was his proximity that was suffocating her now. What, if I ask you to stay behind the curtain with me? Nathaniel said. His dark eyes locked onto hers, burning with a quiet, desperate intensity. Will you stay? The silence in the guest bedchamber was thick enough to choke on. It was a cold, brittle silence, the kind that follows a violent carriage crash before the screaming begins. Nora stood in the center of the faded Persian rug, shivering violently. The rain had soaked through her muslin gown, plastering it to her calves, turning the hem into a heavy, mud-caked weight. She was still wearing Nathaniel's coat. It draped over her small frame like a heavily tailored tent, smelling fiercely of wet wool, cedar, and him. Lady Edith stood by the window, her back rigid. She had dismissed Celia to the adjoining dressing room. Rosalind sat on the edge of the bed, perfectly composed, though her peach gown was ruined with water spots. Take it off, Edith said. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual frantic energy. Nora gripped the lapels of the coat. Her fingers were numb, stiff from the freezing rain. But she pulled the heavy wool tighter around her neck. I am cold, Mother. Edith turned. The look in her eyes was not anger. It was terror. It was the look of a woman who had just watched her last lifeboat catch fire and sink. Take the Duke's coat off, Nora, now! Nora slowly uncurled her fingers. She let the heavy garment slide from her shoulders. It hit the floorboards with a wet, heavy thud. Without it, the chill of the drafty room slammed into her, raising goose flesh across her arms. Edith walked forward. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't strike. She simply looked at Nora with absolute, hollow devastation. Do you know what you have done? Edith whispered. I fell, Nora said, her voice shaking. I slipped on a stone. He helped me up. He carried you into the trees. He left Rosalind, standing in the rain while he stripped off his own coat to cover you. 30 of the worst gossips in England watched him do it. Edith rubbed her temples, her breathing growing shallow and erratic. Lady Shelby was laughing. I heard her. She was laughing at us, the Montgomerys, parading their eldest daughter while the Duke runs off with the clumsy, unremarkable spare. The word stung, precise and sharp. Spare. Nora looked at Rosalind, expecting anger. She expected her sister to join the firing squad. Instead, Rosalind was looking at the ruined hem of her dress. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. It is over, Rosalind said quietly. It is not over. Edith snapped, wheeling on her eldest. "We will say Nora was taken ill, a dizzy spell. The Duke was merely acting as a gentleman. You will wear the crimson silk tonight at the ball. You will ask him for the first dance. We can fix this." "Mother!" Rosalind raised her head. Her beautiful face was completely drained of color, making the artificial pink on her cheeks look clownish. He looked at her when he picked her up from the mud. He did not look at me once today. Not really. He looked at her the way a starving man looks at bread. Rosalind swallowed hard, her composure finally cracking at the edges. "I cannot compete with that. I do not know how. You will learn." Edith's voice finally broke, rising into a shrill, panicked cry. "Lord Croft's solicitor sent a letter this morning. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to ruin your nerves. They are foreclosing on the Yorkshire estate on the 1st of November. We have 3 weeks, Rosalind. 3 weeks before we are living in a boarding house in Cheapside, sewing shirts for a penny apiece. He has to choose you." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. 3 weeks. The walls of the room seemed to rush inward. She looked down at the mud on her hands. She thought of Nathaniel's face in the rain, the desperate intensity in his eyes. Let me worry about Lord Croft. He didn't understand. A duke didn't understand the crushing, breathless terror of poverty. He could wave away a £20,000 debt because he had land to borrow against. The Montgomerys had nothing. If Nathaniel chose Nora, he chose a penniless girl with no dowry, and her family would be thrown to the wolves. Society would not tolerate a duke bailing out his mother-in-law's gambling debts. It was scandalous. It was social suicide. "I will not go down to dinner," Nora said. Her voice sounded hollow, belonging to someone else. "I will not attend the ball tonight. I will pack my trunks. Tell him I left. Tell him I was a passing fancy." Edith stopped pacing. She looked at Nora, a brutal calculation happening behind her eyes. "Yes," Edith said coldly. "You will stay in this room. You will not open the door. If he asks for you, you are severely ill with a fever. Tomorrow, you will take the mail coach back to Yorkshire. Alone." Nora nodded numbly. She walked to the wash basin, breaking the thin crust of ice that had formed on the pitcher's surface, and began to scrub the mud from her skin. The water stung her scrapes, but she welcomed the pain. It was grounding. It was real. Downstairs, in the heavy, oak-paneled sanctuary of the Duke's study, Nathaniel Reed was not thinking about the ball. He sat behind his massive desk, his wet hair dripping onto the leather blotter. He had not changed his clothes. The fire roaring in the hearth was doing little to combat the damp chill in his bones. But he didn't care. Mr. Finch, his solicitor, sat opposite him, looking thoroughly distressed. Finch was a small, nervous man who thrived on order, and his employer was currently radiating chaos. "You wish to do what, Your Grace?" Finch asked, adjusting his spectacles as if he had misheard. "I wish to purchase the debt of the late Lord Montgomery," Nathaniel repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "All of it. Held currently by Lord Croft." Finch blinked rapidly. "Your Grace, that debt is substantial. Croft has already initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Yorkshire property, and if I may be so bold, the Aldridge estate accounts are not exactly flush with liquid capital at this precise moment. We are trying to secure credit, not expend it on charitable ventures. It is not charity. It is an acquisition." Nathaniel pulled the green leather ledger toward him, picking up a pen. He didn't bother dipping it in ink. He just turned it between his long fingers. "Croft is a leech. He wants the Yorkshire estate for the timber. Offer him a 20% premium on the debt. Cash. He will take it." "Cash from where, Your Grace?" "Sell the London townhouse," Nathaniel ordered without hesitating. Finch gasped. Actually gasped. The Mayfair property? Your Grace, that has been in your family for 4 generations. It is your foothold in London society. I despise London society, Nathaniel snarled, slamming the pen down on the desk. The sharp crack made Finch jump. I despise the soot, I despise the gossips, and I despise the fact that I am sitting in a house full of people who are weighing my net worth while eating my food. Sell the damn townhouse, Finch. Buy the Montgomery debt, and draft a settlement. A marriage settlement? Finch asked weakly, reaching for a fresh sheet of parchment. For the elder Miss Montgomery. Rosalind, I believe. No, Nathaniel said, leaning back in his chair. He looked toward the window, where the rain was lashing against the glass. For Nora, Finch's pen paused. The younger one. The one who fell in the mud? The one who knows how to bail water, Nathaniel corrected softly. Have the papers ready by 8 o'clock tonight. The Aldridge Grand Ballroom was a spectacle of light and sound. 3 immense crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, warm glow over the polished parquet floor. A string quartet played a lively waltz from the gallery above. The women, having recovered from the afternoon's disaster, were resplendent in jewels and rich silks, their smiles firmly fixed back in place. Lady Edith stood near the punch bowl, vibrating with nervous energy. Rosalind stood beside her in a breathtaking gown of deep crimson silk, looking like a queen holding court. She was flawless. There was only one problem. The Duke was missing. It was 9:30. The ball had commenced an hour ago, and the host had yet to make an appearance. Whispers were beginning to ripple through the crowd, hiding behind feathered fans and polite coughs. Up in the north wing, the music was nothing but a faint, rhythmic thumping through the floorboards. Nora sat on the floor near the window of the guest chamber, her knees pulled to her chest. She had packed her small trunk. It sat by the door, a tragic, battered thing holding 3 worn dresses and a handful of books. The fire had died down to glowing embers. She hadn't bothered to add more coal. She was tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion had settled over her, heavier than the physical ache of her bruised ribs and scraped knees. She had done the right thing. She had removed herself from the board. Rosalind would shine tonight. The Duke would realize his momentary lapse of judgment in the rain, and the natural order of the universe would be restored. If I ask you to stay behind the curtain with me, will you stay? Nora closed her eyes, resting her forehead against her knees. She couldn't think about his voice. She couldn't think about the way his hands had felt on her face, warm and rough. It was a fairy tale, and she was far too cynical to believe in fairy tales. A heavy, authoritative knock echoed on the chamber door. Nora flinched. "I'm asleep," she called out, assuming it was a maid sent by her mother to ensure she was still locked away. The handle turned. The lock, which Nora had firmly engaged, clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. A heavy iron key was withdrawn from the other side. The door swung inward. Nathaniel Reed stepped into the room. He was dressed in evening attire, a stark white cravat, a dark tailcoat that fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, and a waistcoat of midnight blue. He looked every inch the powerful, terrifying Duke of Aldridge. But his eyes were exactly the same as they had been in the library, tired, sharp, and focused entirely on her. He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was deafening in the quiet room. Nora scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. She was wearing a simple woolen wrapper over her shift, her hair falling in a chaotic, unpinned mess down her back. "You cannot be in here," Nora breathed, retreating a step until her back hit the cold glass of the window. "Your Grace, if someone sees you, if my mother—" "Your mother is downstairs, drinking my punch and trying to convince Lord Shelby that your sister enjoys embroidery," Nathaniel said. He didn't move toward her. He stayed by the door, respecting the space. though his presence seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. "Why are you not at the ball?" "I am ill," Nora lied smoothly, crossing her arms over her chest. "A fever. From the rain." "You are a terrible liar, Nora, and you are trespassing in a lady's bedchamber. I believe that is a hanging offense in some counties." Nathaniel's mouth curved into a faint, humorless smile. He glanced at the battered trunk sitting by the door. His jaw tightened. "You packed." "I am leaving for Yorkshire in the morning," Nora said, forcing her chin up. "It is for the best. I am returning to my role as ballast. You should return to the ballroom. Rosalind is wearing crimson. It is your favorite color, or so my mother insists." Nathaniel let out a low, frustrated sigh. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailcoat and pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of legal parchment. He walked forward, crossing the faded rug, stopping only when he was less than 2 feet away from her. He held the papers out. "What is this?" Nora asked, refusing to take them. "This," Nathaniel said softly, "is the deed to the Yorkshire estate, along with a document confirming the absolute dissolution of your father's debt to Lord Croft." Nora stared at the parchment. Her brain refused to process the words. She looked from the papers to his face. I don't understand." "I bought it," Nathaniel said simply. "I sold the London townhouse this afternoon and purchased the debt. Croft is gone. The house is yours. Your mother's creditors are satisfied." The room spun dangerously. Nora reached out and gripped the edge of the window frame to steady herself. "You sold your townhouse to pay my family's debts?" "Why? Because you told me you were drowning," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. He reached out, taking her cold hand and pressing the heavy parchment into her palm. He folded her trembling fingers over it. "Because you told me that if I pulled you up, your family would sink. So I fixed the boat." Tears, hot and sudden, pricked the corners of Nora's eyes. It was too much. The sheer, overwhelming reality of what he had done crushed the breath out of her. It wasn't just a grand romantic gesture. It was a ruthless, pragmatic, incredibly expensive lifeline. "You fool," Nora whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You are already in debt. You have tenant roofs to fix. You needed a wealthy bride, not a liability. I have enough land to secure a line of credit for the roofs. I don't need a wealthy bride." Nathaniel reached up, his thumb catching the tear on her cheek. "I need you." "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Look at me. I am cynical. I am difficult. I hide behind curtains and I ruin my shoes and I don't know how to flatter you." "That is exactly why," Nathaniel said fiercely. He stepped into her space, his hands coming up to cup her face, anchoring her to him. "Do you think I want a lifetime of flattery? Do you think I want a mirror? I want someone who looks at the ledgers and tells me the truth. I want someone who isn't afraid of the mud. I don't want a duchess, Nora. I want a partner." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was unsteady, betraying the calm facade he wore for the rest of the world. "I am terrified," Nathaniel confessed, his voice a rough whisper against her skin. "I am terrified of failing this estate. I am terrified of ending up like my father. But when I am with you, the noise stops. The arithmetic stops." Nora closed her eyes. The scent of him, clean linen, cedar, and the faint metallic tang of the cold night air, wrapped around her. The cynical armor she had worn for years, the heavy defensive shell she had built to survive the meat market, cracked down the center and fell away. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion, the fear, and the desperate, unwavering hope. "Will you bail water with me?" Nathaniel asked. Nora's hands came up, resting flat against his chest. She felt the heavy, frantic thumping of his heart beneath his immaculate waistcoat. "Yes," Nora whispered. "Give me a bucket." Nathaniel let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan. He didn't hesitate. He kissed her. It wasn't polite, and it wasn't delicate. It was deep, possessive, and entirely desperate, a collision of two people who had spent their lives holding their breath. Nora kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The descent into the ballroom was a tactical operation. Nathaniel did not sneak her down the back stairs. He did not ask her to change into a ball gown. He waited while she put on her least ruined day dress, a simple navy blue wool, and then he took her hand, laced his fingers through hers, and walked her down the grand, sweeping staircase in full view of 60 guests. The string quartet stumbled, the cellist missing a note entirely, as a horrific, screeching silence fell over the room. Fans stopped fluttering. Glasses of punch were lowered. Every eye in the room snapped to the staircase, locking on to the Duke of Aldridge and the plain, unadorned third daughter of the disgraced Montgomery family. Lady Edith dropped her glass. It shattered on the parquet floor, crystal fragments spraying across the polished wood. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He led Nora straight across the floor, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. They walked directly to Lady Edith and Rosalind. Edith looked as though she were about to faint. Her face cycled through white, purple, and a terrifying shade of grey. "Your Grace," she choked out, staring at his hand firmly holding her youngest daughter's. What is the meaning of this?" "Nora is ill. She is meant to be in bed." "Nora is perfectly well, Lady Edith," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the dead, silent room. He reached into his coat and withdrew the folded parchment, holding it out to Edith. "I believe this belongs to you." Edith took the paper with trembling hands. She unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the legal script, and Nora watched her mother physically deflate. The rigid posture collapsed. The frantic, terrified energy that had driven her for 3 years simply vanished. Edith looked at Nathaniel, her eyes wide with shock. You bought it," Edith whispered. "The Yorkshire estate is free and clear. Your debts are settled," Nathaniel said smoothly. He did not smile. He was entirely businesslike. "Consider it a bridal settlement. I have asked for Nora's hand in marriage, and she has accepted." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Lady Shelby actually swooned, requiring a footman to catch her. Rosalind, standing beside her mother, looked at Nora. For a terrifying second, Nora braced herself for hatred. She had stolen the prize. She had broken the unspoken rule, but Rosalind didn't look angry. She looked at the deed in her mother's hands, and then she looked at Nathaniel. Slowly, a genuine, completely uncalculated smile broke across Rosalind's beautiful face. The tension left her shoulders. The invisible corset she wore over her mind snapped. "Thank you, Your Grace," Rosalind said quietly. She meant it. She didn't want him. She had never wanted him. She just wanted to stop being terrified of the future. Nathaniel inclined his head to Rosalind with genuine respect. Then he looked down at Nora. The Duke of Aldridge, in front of the most judgmental, ruthless society gossips in the country, raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Shall we find a quiet corner, Miss Montgomery?" Nathaniel asked softly. "I believe there is a curtain in the drawing room with our names on it, Your Grace," Nora replied, a small, genuine smile curving her lips. 6 months later, the Somerset mud was still a problem. The spring thaw had turned the grounds of Aldridge Hall into a swamp. In the estate manager's office, the fire roared, fighting off the damp chill of April. Nora sat behind the massive oak desk, her hair pinned up in a haphazard knot that was slowly unraveling. She was wearing a simple, practical dress, and her fingers were stained with ink. In front of her, sat the green leather ledger. "If we delay the purchase of the new carriage," Nora said, running a finger down a column of numbers, "we can allocate the funds to purchase slate for the village of Lower Hingsby. That covers 20 cottages before the autumn rains." Nathaniel stood by the window, his sleeves rolled up, looking out at the muddy fields. He turned and, leaning back against the sill, a fond, amused smile playing on his lips. "I am the Duke of Aldridge," he pointed out mildly. "It is expected that I have a carriage that does not rattle when it goes over cobblestones." "You have a horse," Nora countered without looking up. "You can ride. The tenants cannot sleep with buckets on their beds." "Ruthless," Nathaniel murmured, walking across the room. He came up behind her chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck, right where her pulse beat. "Absolutely ruthless. I married a tyrant." "You married an accountant," Nora corrected, leaning back into his warmth. She closed the ledger. The satisfying thud of the thick pages echoed in the quiet room. "And you love it?" Nathaniel chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling in his chest. He spun her chair around, framing her face with his hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, with the same intense, grounding focus he had shown her on that first night behind the velvet curtain. There were no ball gowns, there was no poetry. There was only the mud, the ledgers, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that they were holding the roof up together. "I do," Nathaniel said softly. "God help me, I do." Did this grounded, muddy, and deeply real romance capture your heart? Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't found on the dance floor, but hiding right behind the curtains. If you loved watching Nora and Nathaniel tear down the toxic marriage mart and build a true partnership, please hit that like button, share this video with fellow historical drama lovers, and subscribe for more raw, cynical, and emotional storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen the ballroom or the velvet curtain? See you in the next tale.